I'm going to make another assumption. You have all or most of your major tools by now. Your table saw, bandsaw, drill press, joiner, router table. So what do you need as far as professional tools? Does that mean a 36-inch joiner? Planer. Get rid of that 12-inch DeWalt. Maybe you need a 52-inch drum sander. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Roger Kugler. You're here at Working at Woodworking podcast, and I'm going to try to answer some of those questions for you during this episode on professional tools in your workshop. You know, if you go out and walk into most professional shops, which I hope you already have by now, you're going to recognize the vast majority of the tools there. They might have a 36-inch planer while you only have a 15-inch planer. But for the large part, most of the tools that the pros use, a lot of hobbyists use. In fact, I've been into a lot of hobbyist workshops, amateurs, especially retired people. They are so much nicer than mine. Oh my gosh. I remember I interviewed for a job at a wood shop that was associated with a very large lumber yard in town, 24 years ago at least. And I walked in and I recognized everything. They had this gorgeous 36-inch cast iron bandsaw. You know, the one with the kind of homemade guards on it, because when this thing was built, there was no such thing as OSHA. You know, if you were foolish enough to stick your arm in the bandsaw, it was going to get cut off. And the foreman who was interviewing me asked if there was any tool in the shop that I was unfamiliar with. And I kind of looked around and walked over to this one tool. I knew that it drilled, but I wasn't exactly sure what. It looked almost like a mortising machine, but it wasn't. And I admitted I did not know what that was. And he kind of laughed and chuckled to himself, and he goes, "Well, you're not the only one. That is a door mortising machine. And we probably haven't used that in 30 years. So there you go." So could we sum this up that professionals use really big machines? Well, some of them do. A lot of them don't. And, you know, it's almost a moot point because those guys probably have employees, and that's not what we're focused on. You and I are not big. We're a one-person shop. And if you want to be big, you want to have employees, this is not really the podcast for you. In fact, I would recommend you go over and listen to the Woodworking Network podcast, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. It's a wonderful podcast, particularly targeting the, I'd say, small to medium-sized woodworking companies, probably, I'll say 5 to 100 employees. They get into some really gnarly stuff. It's very interesting for anybody to listen to. They talk about some subjects that affect all of us, big and small. Anyway, so what are professional grade tools? That $5,000 Powermatic BP3000, 5 horsepower, 230 VAC with a 50-inch rip fence. Yeah, I'd probably say that's a professional tool, although don't be surprised if you see that in a retired lawyer's workshop. Nothing against retired lawyers. You're just as likely to see a $500 DeWalt job site table saw. This kind of leads us into the decision tree that you are going to have to tackle when you are buying some tools to outfit your shop. And at the very top of that decision tree, question number 1 that you need to ask yourself, do you really need that tool, or do you want that tool? Big difference here. Must you really have a cordless 16-gauge nail gun, or would a pneumatic gun work just as well? I was under a big quandary years ago, thinking about the 16-gauge cordless nail gun. And I've made a decision as I was lugging my pancake air compressor up the 3rd flight of stairs, that if I ever got around to buying a cordless nail gun, I would immediately subtract $100 from its retail price and use that number to make my decision as to whether to buy it or not. Because even a small compressor after 3 flights of stairs starts to get pretty heavy. And I figured that was worth something. It was worth my time of having to drag that thing up there. It was worth the wear and tear on my body, dragging that thing up there. And if I was going to do this for another 50 times, would it be worth actually investing into a 16-gauge cordless nailer? Oh, by the way, the answer is absolutely. Oh my gosh, talking about another life changer. Well, let's not digress into that. So number 2, what do you need this tool to do? Should you go for versatility, or should you go for specialization? Now here's an example. Should you buy a table saw, or should you buy a track saw? Track saws are becoming very, very popular nowadays. It kind of comes down to what you need that tool to do. If you need to cut dados, game over, table saw. If you need to make a whole bunch of end grain cuts, table saw, or maybe miter saw, depending on the width. Do you need to create 1/32 inch strips of wood? Yeah, that's going to probably be a table saw too. You could do it with a track saw, but it's not going to be pretty. Well, you need to build a sled to make angled cuts at a specific bevel. Again, that's a job for a table saw. Or are you going to be building a whole bunch of cabinets, maybe outfitting a kitchen? You know, track saws are really good at that nowadays. They cut perfectly straight lines. And I don't know about you, but I can cut a crooked line on a table saw. Yes, I have done it before. So you see there, we have versatility, but we also have speciality. The one tool gives us almost infinite variety of different jobs, different cuts that it can make. But the other one does one thing really, really well, over and over and over. So that kind of gets into the versatility versus the specialization. Another example I could think of is the Festool Domino. It does one thing really, really well. In fact, that even brings us to number 3, speed and repeatability. You know, I can cut mortise and tenon joints by hand. I don't want to, especially if I'm trying to build a face frame for a cabinet or a bookcase or something like that. I've done it. I just would rather grab a Festool and let it do it for me. It is incredibly fast and it is incredibly repeatable. And that leads us into cost. How much will one tool save you versus another tool? If you can buy a tool, let's use a domino since we're already on it, for joinery work, what would the cost difference be in your production time versus mortise and tenon, pocket hole joinery, dowels, whatever? Well, there was actually a magazine article, and of course I can't remember the name of the magazine. It may have been Fine Woodworking. Don't quote me on that. Where they did exactly that. They did an analysis of various types of joinery methods for building a face frame. They considered the initial cost of the tool. They considered the cost of the materials, screws, dominoes, biscuits, dowels. They considered the speed of accomplishing each joint. I bet you can probably already guess who won. Cutting mortise and tenons by hand had a very, very low initial cost. 1-2 chisels, layout tools, which you probably already have. Maybe the pocket screw joinery. A little bit more money, cost of screws, time. It came down to the domino just blowing the other methods out of the water. Sure, initial cost was really high, but cost per joint was very, very low. So if you were going to make 1,000 joints, how much time would that take? What would the cost of that ultimately be? And so there we're really siding on the side of specialization, although the initial cost is very, very high. If you want an interesting study in tool use, study some of the Victorian era furniture, the late 1800s, early 1900s, where furniture moved from small workshops to factories. And a lot of that furniture was built with mortise and tenon. They were not cutting mortise and tenons by hand. They had entire machines that were doing that. Very, very large machines. Like there's this one mortise and tenoning machine. It's the size of like 3 refrigerators. It's huge. It weighs thousands of pounds. And they figured out that if they invested the money in this machine, the number of joints over the next 20 years would easily pay for the machine and drastically increase their profit on that product because of the speed, efficiency, and accuracy of making the mortise and tenon joinery. So this isn't new. We've been doing this for, several hundred years. And I'm going to throw out number 5 on here. And it's the question that's probably the hardest to ask yourself. What do you really need to get this job done? Can you do this job with a straight edge and your circular saw? Or do you really need a track saw system? And that's where that need and want quandary comes back up. So to me, it just kind of comes down to cash. Do I have the cash on hand to make that purchase? Or sometimes I'll carrot and stick myself that if I get this big job done, then I will buy that tool. Sometimes I have made the decision to buy the tool to get that big job done. And that's worked out well too. Just make sure that you have the job and you don't spend $500,000, $2,000 on a tool and then that job falls through. That is not good. So ultimately, you get to decide. This is your business after all. So you get to decide, I really would like a new table saw. But of course the kid needs braces. I'm going to leave that one up to you. So, where do you buy your tools? You could buy retail. There's a lot of, Woodcraft, Rockler, type stores around. You could buy online. You could buy from a professional woodworking shop. Usually these are located in large cities or in centers that have a very strong, woodworking industry built around them. You might not get the best deal on a more, pedestrian type tool. You might actually get a better price at like a Woodcraft or a Rockler. A lot of those stores, they're really after the higher end machinery, so they don't get down into the lower end tools so much, but they're certainly, worth, giving a look. You can shop online. That's probably the best way of comparing prices. And of course, you've got to compare, service and delivery and all the other things that go along with that. If I'm buying a really expensive tool, I like to look at it. So that kind of lends a little bit more to buying local. And, for a lot of your lower priced tools, there's the big box stores, the big orange, the big blue, the big green. So what about buying new versus used? Should you even mess with used tools? I think you should. I have a lot of used tools, and with only one or two exceptions, they've all turned out to be very good. I love to shop auctions. If there's a particular tool that I'm looking for, I'll also go on to Craigslist. And don't be afraid to visit one of your competitors and just kind of chat them up. And by the way, you wouldn't happen to have an old bandsaw that you're, no longer using. I'm not looking for anything very big, 12, 14, 16 inch, something like that. You'd be surprised. They may have one stuck over in a corner with about 3 inches of dust on top of it that hasn't moved in 10 years. And they would be more than happy to help you load that onto your vehicle and just get it out of here. Okay, let's talk about what I consider one of the big differences between professional grade tools and hobby grade tools. And this was told to me by Mark Adams of the Mark Adams Woodworking School here in Indiana. He had contact with a major tool manufacturer, and they were wanting to design a new router, and they had hired him as a consultant. And one of the things that he discovered was that very often the engineers and designers of a new tool aren't woodworkers, and they've never really used these tools before. So hence, hiring someone who has. And they explained to him that there's a huge difference between making a $50 router and a $400 router. Obviously, the quality of the parts that go into the router. The $50 router is basically all plastic, fairly low-grade plastic at that, where the $400 router is going to be much higher-grade plastic and probably a lot more metal. But the big difference was the price points that they were positioning their tools at. They needed a $50 router because they had done research and they found that the average person who buys a $50 router uses it for approximately, I believe it was 7 minutes. And the engineer explained that a guy comes out on a Saturday to a big box store and he wants to buy a router because he watched some guy on TV or on YouTube or his uncle, had a router and he was really impressed by it. So he buys this router. And he takes it home. He takes it out of the box. He reads the instruction manual, from cover to cover. Well, at least the English part. No, they don't do that. And plugs the thing in and turns it on and it screams. And he turns it off and he puts it back in the box and it goes up onto the top shelf and it's sold at a yard sale 5 years later for $7. Versus the professional who is going to run a router for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. And this is called duty cycle. How long do they expect this machine to run at a time? The $50 router, they expect someone to operate that for like 7 minutes at a time every other weekend when there wasn't a good ball game on, and the total life expectancy of that router was like 49 hours. After the 49th hour of it running, it would self-destruct. Versus the $400 router that was expected to run 5 or 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, for, several thousand hours. Another example of duty cycle would be my little DeWalt lunchbox planer. It does a marvelous job. A 32nd of an inch at a time. Beautiful finish. I actually hone my blades. It comes out at probably 220, maybe ready for 320 grit sandpaper. Just a marvelous job at a 32nd of an inch at a time. It takes forever to do anything. Yeah, I know. I could take a heavier cut, but the finish quality goes down. And frankly, I don't want to burn this thing up by trying to hog off a 16th of an inch of white oak, 4 or 5 hours a day. In fact, I can't run that 4 or 5 hours a day. I can get probably about 30 minutes out of it, and I've learned to actually put my hand over the motor to feel how hot it's getting. And there is a overheat circuit interrupter in there, so if it gets too hot, it will shut itself down. I've only done that maybe 2 or 3 times in the last 10 years or so. And I also have a Woodmaster set up with a planer head. And it's I think it is a 3-horse motor. And that thing takes 3/16 of an inch of white oak away. Doesn't really even think about it. And it can do that all day. So it's just the different expectation of the machine that you're getting. I think that when you're going into the professional market, you need to be looking at the higher end tools. Unless it's just something that you're going to use occasionally. I bought a little strip belt sander off of Amazon. I think it's a Win. It cost, I don't know, $25, maybe $30. I use it occasionally, but I don't expect to run that 10 hours a day. And I don't mean to sound like a tool snob, because I'm the farthest thing from a tool snob. I have I think it's called Shop Tools 6-inch belt and disc sander. I got it years ago from Menards. It's the bottom of the barrel. They scraped this thing together. The whole thing I think was like $100, maybe $120. You can easily spend $700, $800, $900, from Jet or Powermatic or something like that. This thing has done great. I've had to redo the platen on it because it was either hollowed out or not flat, but I wasn't getting a good finish on wood, and I kind of modified the platen, and it just does a wonderful job for, $120 over 12 years. That's $10 a year. For what I use it for, it does very, very well. And here's just another little tip. If you get into buying tools, some tools will advertise themselves as 1.5 horsepower or 1 horse, 3/4 horse. I was looking at, table saws the other day on Amazon, and they advertised a particular table saw that ran on 120 volts at 4 horsepower. And I'm thinking, you can't do that, because about the maximum horsepower you can get out of a 120 circuit is about 1.5. So I went to the company's webpage, and sure enough, they had it listed at like 1.35 horsepower. But either somebody on the other site hit the wrong keys, or they were trying to purposely mislead. I rely more on the amperage of the tool than the horsepower, especially with like dust collectors and vacuums and things like that. Those numbers are just all over the place, but a 7 amp motor has the capacity of producing more power than a 3 amp motor. And you can't really get around that. Of course, depending on how the motor, the tool is designed, the gearing and so on and so forth, there can be a difference. But as kind of a general rule, look at the amperage. That's going to tell you the power that tool can deliver. Okay, let's talk about some of the other differences you might find between a professional shop and a hobby shop. I think you'll find more backups in a professional shop. You're going to have 2, maybe 3 backup bandsaw blades. Because if you're in the middle of a job and you're using a bandsaw and you break a blade, you may not be able to wait 2 or 3, 4 days to order a new one online. You might be out in the middle of the country, and you have to drive an hour, 2 hours to a town, a city to buy one in person. And that's downtime you just cannot afford. So you need to have some backups on critical parts. Saw blades, you should probably have an extra. Router bits, especially router bits that are critical to a particular part or product. If you break that, you're kind of shut down. Router bits aren't that expensive. Have 2 or 3 of them in standby. Sandpaper. Gone are the days of going to the hardware store and buying a pack of sandpaper. You need to be buying sandpaper by the 100, maybe the 50. But, that pack of 10, no, that's not going to cut it anymore. You're going to spend more time going back and forth to the store than you are, sanding wood that is hopefully making you money. Glue. Buy it by the gallons. You're going to be using it. Forget about that little, 8-ounce squeeze bottle. Buy a gallon of glue. Finish. They say it's cheaper in volume. And if you can get a gallon of finish as opposed to a quart or, God forbid, the little pint cans, buy it. If you can use it before that product were to go bad. So finishes and paint and things like that, you have to be a little careful. Buy what you can use in a reasonable period of time. Screws, you're buying those by the 100, maybe the 1,000, depending on what you're building, how quickly you're moving through these things. Dowels or dominoes, any consumable, you should be buying in bulk to get the best price. And speaking of backups, V-belts. There's probably a V-belt on your bandsaw, maybe on your table saw, 6-inch belt sander. Do you have backups for the V-belts? Because if they break, are you shut down for half a day while you try to hunt one down near where you live? It's easier to have them and never need them than to need them and not have them. I think that's the insurance industry that comes up with that. Some other differences, your sanding system. The faster you can get something sanded, the faster you can get it finished, the faster you can get paid. So if you're using a 3-inch or a 5-inch sander, it might be time to step up to a 6-inch. It's absolutely amazing how much more quickly you can sand a tabletop with a 6-inch sander than a 5-inch sander. I know that sounds kind of weird. We could do the math if you wanted. I don't want to. But it's a significant difference between a 5-inch and a 6-inch. So if you don't have a 6-inch sander, I would recommend kind of adding that to your wish list. because it really just boils down to time is money. Dust collection. You're no longer working in your shop, 2.5 hours on Saturday afternoon. You're working in your shop, well, hopefully, 4 or 5 hours a day. And the rest of the time you're probably spending in the office, taking care of emails and phone calls and ordering product and writing out bids and trying to get people to pay you, so on and so forth. But you need good dust collection. You don't want to be breathing this stuff. And good dust collection means collected at the source. I have a circular saw, a Porter cable circular saw that I bought 20 years ago. It was used. That thing may be 30 years old, and it is just a workhorse. It's a 15 amp. I don't know what the horsepower rating is. It's a 15 amp. That's as high as you can get on a household circuit without going into like 220. And it just cuts. It will walk through white oak like it's just butter. But it's getting old, and it's getting a little cranky. And I thought maybe I should replace this. The one thing that this has that I really love is a dust collection port at the leading edge of the blade. I hook the vacuum up to it. It just collects 96% of the dust. It does a very, very good job. So I did a little bit of online shopping for a new circular saw, and guess what? With the exception of the track saws, all the circular saws don't have dust collection. They have a little chute that spews it out the back. If you're up on the roof, laying down sheeting, that's not a big deal. But I'm in a small workshop. I don't want that dust going everywhere. I have worked very, very hard to try to keep, a clean shop. So I don't know. I might see about reconditioning this saw. Should you put money into a 30-year-old saw? Well, none of the track saws have the power that this thing has. Or if they do, they're incredibly expensive. So I don't know what I'm going to do there. But think about that dust collection. Get what you can. And the one tool area that everybody, I think, struggles with is a sharpening system. Now, if you don't use hand tools very often, your sharpening system is knowing who to send your saw blades out to have sharpened. If you use hand tools, that means having a system, diamond stone, water stone, sandpaper, rocks, I don't care, but having a system that you can get an edge on a tool very quickly. This shouldn't be a major reduction. It shouldn't be something that you have to schedule during your day that I'm going to sharpen this tool. It should be something that you set up in about 45 seconds and you put an edge on in the next 45 seconds, and you have 45 more seconds to reinsert it into the plane and put it back to work. You have 3 minutes. I'll give you 3 minutes to have an edge, a really good edge on a tool. So if you don't have that right now, that's something I would encourage you to work on if you're using hand tools. No, I'm going to take that back. Even if you don't use a lot of hand tools, you should still be able to sharpen your tools. There's no reason to be, showing up at a job site with, 3 or 4 chisels that are, duller than a butter knife. So learn to sharpen your tools. And the one that I probably struggled with the most is an HVLP spray booth. There, I said it. You need one. You need to spray finish. Sure, it's romantic to break out the boar's hair brush that came from the upper mountains of the China highlands of these wild boars. No. you need to get finish on the product quickly. Remember that old time is money thing? This is where the metal meets the road. Wait, I don't think that was right. This is where you make your money. I so wish somebody had told me years ago, stop screwing around with this, stop screwing around with that. Get an HVLP sprayer and set up some type of a spray booth. Spray booth does not have to be big and super fancy, especially if you're using waterborne finishes, which I'm really going that way. I've kind of had it with odors, fumes, and a wife complaining that the place stinks. And with the finishes that I've been playing around with, I've been very impressed with them. So if you don't have a spray booth, figure one out. And the next to the last tool system I'm going to talk about is an entertainment system. Yes, that's right. You're going to spend a lot of time in the shop, a lot more than you used to. And, well, quite frankly, it can get boring out there. So have something to listen to. Radio, music player, smartphone, even a TV. And I think the important thing is that if you are listening to something and you're using power tools and the phone rings, you have a way of hearing the phone. If I'm using my Bluetooth headphones and the phone rings, it cuts the Bluetooth out. And so I know to look over at the phone, and I can see that the phone app has popped up, and I can stop what I'm doing and go answer the phone, or not. If I'm doing a big production run of something and I have like 5 machines running at once, and I have a face mask on and headphones, and it takes me like 3 minutes to shut everything down, the phone call is going to be over by then, and I just let it go to voicemail. So don't be enslaved to the phone, but be aware of it. And the last, but certainly not least tool in the workshop, your brain. And we're going to actually talk more about that in the next podcast, number 12. But your brain is the most important tool that you have in the shop with you. It can keep you out of trouble. It can save you from harm. It can make you money if you use it right. And we'll get into more on that next time. So that about wraps up this episode. The recommendation of the week is the woodworkingnetwork.com. They have a wonderful website, a lot of the latest tech news in the woodworking industry, and the podcast, which I find very, very enjoyable. And since this is episode 11, I told you that episode 12 is my last scheduled episode, and I would love to hear from you. Should I continue these? Should I go on? Should I wrap it up? Should I never have started this in the first place? So you can send me an email at roger@working@woodworking.com. I would love to hear from you. I have about 3 jobs out in the shop that I've got to get finished up. Fortunately, I don't have anyone walking up the driveway right now with a broken chair. That was actually yesterday. So until then, I am wishing you happy woodworking.